Hello friends, this is Amit and welcome to my channel. I'm a full stack developer in C Sharp and Angular and I have 11.5 years experience. So if you're preparing for an interview, there are very good chances that I might be able to help. See guys, nowadays people do not start the interview with basic questions like what are the concepts of oops. Those were olden days, my generation time. In your generation, people ask you questions directly starting from JavaScript. Okay, so that is a bare minimum that they'll start with. They won't be satisfied with things that, okay, I know the concept about oops, principles, and everything. Those were olden days. Or design patterns. Nowadays, nobody asks you about design patterns. They expect you to know them automatically. Okay, so here is the updated, focus of the interview. They'll start with JavaScript. They'll spend a lot of time over here, maybe 10-15 minutes they'll spend over here, and they'll be asking you these kind of questions. They'll start you with basic questions like, what is the difference between ECMAScript, JavaScript, TypeScript. Now, this was a question in my generation. This was the last question of the interview. It was a good to have knowledge about JavaScript. If you knew about JavaScript, it was like, okay, you're a flamboyant person, you know everything about the technology, and now you know about JavaScript also. But nowadays, that is not the case. JavaScript is a whole core of your, interview nowadays. So you start with the JavaScript question, then what is ECMAScript, what is TypeScript, and JavaScript, and then they'll slowly ask you about, what is the difference between ES5, ES6, and then what is lexical scoping, and all. See, these are the first few questions that you are asked. And these are very heavy questions. If you fail to answer these questions, your interview, goes for a toss, I can say. So be very ready with JavaScript. I've prepared a separate playlist for JavaScript. Then they will slowly creep into TypeScript. So about TypeScript, you don't require to know much. The only thing that you need to know is TypeScript is like a superset of JavaScript. TypeScript transpiles to JavaScript because browser understands only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it doesn't understand TypeScript. TypeScript has to transpile to JavaScript and then fed to the browser. Okay, and then you should also be aware that in TypeScript file you can always write in plain old JavaScript, so it is backward compatible. Okay, that's it, nothing more. Then they'll dive into the real part of the interview, and that is your Angular. So they'll grill you down over here on Angular. About that, maybe I have a separate playlist for that. You can go through it. All of those questions are really important, so please go through the entire playlist. Then they will just quickly ask you about CSS before diving into backend. Okay, this is just a good to have thing, but what they'll expect you to know over here is what are the various values of position attribute, then what is box model, then what are pseudo classes, pseudo elements, and what is flexbox. Nowadays they ask about flexbox, and then finally what are media queries. Okay, these are a few big things. And then they'll ask you that are you at least aware, have you heard about SCSS, SAS, and less? So you should always say, yes, I've heard about them. They are like supersets of CSS, and just like TypeScript transpiles to JavaScript, when you write in any of these languages, then they get transpiled to CSS. Okay. Now they'll definitely ask you that, when you already have CSS, then what is the need to have all of these things? Because finally the code is anyways going to transpile to CSS and then fed to the browser. So you should answer that, they give a couple of good features, like, you can define variables in them. So if a color has to be used at multiple places, you can always create a variable for it. Then you can say that you can also have mixins wherein, it will be like functions. You will create a mixin for a style getting repeated in multiple places in your style sheet. And then wherever it gets repeated, you just include that particular mixin. So you write it once and you use it multiple times. Then it also provides you the feature of, partial style sheets. So CSS, plain old CSS doesn't provide you partial style sheets. So these guys provide it, and so on. So if you can remember more features, then it is okay. Otherwise, at least these three features you should be aware of, and you will pass it. This is anyways a good to have thing. Even if you don't answer these questions very well, it doesn't hurt your interview as much. Okay, and now, in the backend, depending upon whether you're a Java guy or a C Sharp guy, you'll be asked this question. So if you're a C Sharp guy, you'll be definitely asked about WCF. You should be aware of it. very well. And I mean, see, in WCF, you'll even be asked, what are web services? In general, what are web services and so on? Then what is REST? What is SOAP? SOAP nowadays nobody asks, but at least REST concepts they'll be asking, etc. Okay, so be prepared for them. Then they'll be asking you about entity framework. See, if you're a C# guy, definitely they'll ask you about entity framework. So you should be aware about code first approach, model first approach, database first approach, and so on. Okay. And then some people even ask you to code for an entity framework project. So that is where the problem starts. You know everything in the theory, but nothing in practical, and that is where you fail the interview. So be prepared about it. Be prepared to actually, be able to create entity framework model, because this is very confusing, and in practice, unless you see a YouTube video to guide you, it is difficult to create an entity framework project. So I have a playlist for entity framework also, you can go through it. Then you will be asked about lambda expressions and link queries. At least the basics you'll be asked. Okay, now if you're a Java guy, then instead of WCF, you'll be asked about Java WS. Then instead of entity framework, you'll be asked about JPA or Hibernate. Now, instead of lambda expression and link queries, you'll be asked about, if you're using JPA, then JPQL, and if you're using Hibernate, then Hibernate query language, that is SQL. So these are a few questions that they'll just definitely ask you about the backend, and then you're clear. Okay, that is enough. You do not require to know about the core C# programming. It's not required. Nobody will ask you what is public, private. Nobody goes into those details nowadays. But you should be aware of WCF and entity framework. Okay. Now in the database, they won't expect you to know much, because anyways, web developers are different than database designers. Okay. So, but at least you'll be expected to know about joins, indexes, transactions, stored procs, etc. Okay. Even if you prepare for these 4 topics, it's more than enough. If they ask you anything more than that, that means your interview is really going well. That means they think you are capable of answering good questions, and that is why they are taking interest into you. So that means you're giving a very good interview. Okay. So, but I think at least these 4 things you should be aware of. So now let us think and create a strategy of how to pass an interview. So 30% of your weightage goes on Angular and Backend. Okay, so these 2 topics you should be very thorough about. Okay, then the next most important weightage is on JavaScript. Also, JavaScript is a topic that you start the interview with. So this creates your first impression. So do not goof up with JavaScript. If you goof up over here, the rest of the interview, the tone of the interview will be set in the wrong direction. And so you should be prepared about JavaScript. So this is the second priority thing. First priority to Angular and backend, second priority to JavaScript. And the third priority you can give to CSS, because this is where you should be asked questions about. TypeScript anyways you don't require to remember much. Okay, so third priority goes over here. Fourth priority should go to the database, because these are quite confusing topics sometimes, and you should keep yourself revised about these topics, like what are clustered index, what are non-clustered index, and why do we use them, etc., etc. So you should keep yourself updated once in a while. And then last, if you still have a lot of time, then TypeScript, even if you read about it, I don't think you will be asked any questions about TypeScript. So yeah, it's just good to have. They'll just touch the topic. You'll only require to know that TypeScript is superset of JavaScript and it gets transferred to Java. That's all that you really need to know. Okay, so that's it. All the best for your interview. This was your host Amit Chirasau signing off.